Great, thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to start off talking about thematic analysis from the kind of strategies level, the kind of analytic methods level. And it's worth saying at the outset that thematic analysis is actually a broad term within which there are lots of different approaches. And there's quite a long history of thematic analysis. I've got up there a few textbooks, some of which are relatively old now. The first one there, Transforming Qualitative Information, is from 1998, I think. But thematic analysis has been popularised more recently, certainly in the UK, by Brown and Clark, who published an article in 2006 that's had an incredible number of citations. And they recently, a couple of years ago now, published a textbook when they described their approach to thematic analysis that they now call reflexive thematic analysis in great detail. And it's that approach that I'm going to focus on today as an example. But just to say, this is just one application of thematic analysis. And the reason that I've gone umbrella on the slide is because I very much see the term thematic analysis as an umbrella term within which there are multiple different methods. So, for example, template analysis, framework analysis are seen to be forms of thematic analysis as well. Yeah, I'm aware there's an echo. There's a massive echo for me as well. That's why I've taken my headphones out, because I'm hearing myself twice. I don't know why that echo is. I'm sorry about that, Hans. But I'm going to continue regardless. Okay, so having set the scene in that way briefly, let's just have a look at the phases of what Brown and Clark are calling now reflexive thematic analysis. And they describe in quite a lot of detail in their textbook these 6 phases. And I'm going to go through each of those phases today and make some comments and reflections around those phases. And I'm going to do that, obviously, in the context of MAXQDA. So really what I'm aiming to do is to think a little bit today about how we can harness the tools that MAXQDA provides for us in a powerful way for the analytic tasks that are involved in thematic analysis, using Brown and Clark's as an example. Okay, so I'm going to do that. Those of you who know the way that I like to talk about methods and tools will be unsurprised by the fact that I'm going to start off thinking about the strategies level, thinking about the actual analytic method, and then thinking about how we can use the tools in MAXQDA to operationalize these methods. So this is a photo from the textbook, Reflexive Thematic Analysis textbook, where they briefly outline phase 1 of the process, which is called familiarizing yourself with the data set. And you can see here that I've highlighted areas of this description using 2 colors. Red are highlighting the kind of analytic tasks involved in this phase as they are described, and in green I've highlighted the levels at which they are recommending that we work. There are multiple levels at which we work in any analysis, and Brown and Clark allude to those in various ways. So let's just have a quick look at this phase 1. They talk about becoming deeply and intimately familiar with the content of all of the materials that you're working with through a process of what they call immersion, so becoming very deeply embedded in the data. And they talk about how practically that involves reading and rereading the material multiple times, listening to recordings or watching videos if you're working with multimedia data, and making brief notes about any analytic ideas that strike you as you are working. So those are the key tasks: the reading and reading and the making notes. And they allude to the idea that that happens at 2 levels: at each data item, each segment of data that strikes you as being interesting, and at the level of the data set as a whole. Okay, so having thought about those tasks and levels at which we work in this phase, how can MAXQDA help? Well, I would suggest that MAXQDA tools, we can use MAXQDA tools to help with these tasks in this phase in a number of different ways. And I often like to distinguish between what I call slow and low thoughtful immersion at the data level and higher, faster level immersion or familiarization. So I'm going to pick out a couple of ways of illustrating those two different levels and tools that we could use. So first of all, thinking about the slow, low exploration. This can happen both before we start working in MAXQDA and within MAXQDA. So one of the features that came out a while ago, I'm not sure if it was the previous version or 2020 maybe, was the ability to transfer any highlights and comments that you may have had on transcripts in Word files into highlighted codes and memos inside MAXQDA. And for me, that ability really opens up all kinds of possibilities for working with textual materials, not only Word, but also PDFs, and also including different participants and researchers in the process. So if you've done some of that exploration work outside of MAXQDA using some of those tools, then that can be fully integrated and implemented once you get inside the software as well. And what's really powerful about doing that work using MAXQDA rather than staying outside of MAXQDA is those highlights. You can see hopefully that the highlights in the colors are actually also codes, and that means that we can retrieve those passages of data very, very easily. And you can also see on the right hand side that any comments that you may have made outside MAXQDA come through as memos. So everything is interconnected, interlinked within the tool. So therefore, we can replicate very closely how we may be used to working in that way for that familiarization phase inside MAXQDA. But for me, it's also really important to reflect on how tools allow us different ways of accomplishing tasks than would otherwise be possible. And that's where that alternate level of what I call high, fast exploration, immersion comes into play. So, for example, we can generate word frequency lists and visualizations. Here's a visualization. I'm using data that Brown and Clark actually talk about in their textbook and make available on their companion website to illustrate this. Here we've got a word cloud visualization, but you've also got the ability to generate visualizations of phrases. MAXQDA calls those word combinations, and that allows us to immerse and think about the data on a completely different level than when we're reading and making those comments in the way that I described previously. The thing that's really powerful, I think, for using MAXQDA for this process is that this high-level work, when we're looking at individual words or phrases, are always interconnected back to this source material in the background. So this is not applicable because it's a PowerPoint, but if I was in MAXQDA, I'd be able to access the context within which these words and phrases were occurring. And that's a very powerful way to quickly immerse and become familiar. We've also got the interactive word tree in MAXQDA, which allows us to look at particular phrases in a different visualization. And this data that Brown and Clark are using in their textbook is all about it's Facebook posts about the choice to not have children in your life. So that's a little bit of background about the data. Okay, so I mentioned that it's always possible to get back to the context, and this for me is one of the key reasons to use MAXQDA is that interconnectivity. If I'm working in hard copy, then that becomes very difficult, but it's always possible whenever I'm retrieving phrases. So here the phrase "life without kids" in the search results from a phrase, a word combinations visualization allows me very easily see that within the actual context of the data. So that's one aspect of that first phase. The second aspect of that first phase is the making of the notes. So not just familiarizing and immersing, but the second task, you may remember they talked about making brief notes about their analytic ideas. And MAXQDA not only has at least 3 different writing spaces that can be used for this particular analytic task, paraphrases, comments, and memos, but also we can visualize those notes in various different ways in that kind of interconnected way that I've been highlighting. So what I'm going to show you now is not every single possible way, but just focus on a couple of those spaces, paraphrases and memo, and illustrate via codes how those notes can be gathered together. So here, for example, if you're not familiar with the paraphrasing tool, there is a spotlight specifically about paraphrases, and I'm sure paraphrases are mentioned in various other spotlights as well. But paraphrases are really essentially designed specifically for this kind of task that Brown and Clark talk about in their method. So we can highlight segments of text, or it doesn't have to be text, but text in this example that we find interesting, and we can use the paraphrase to make those analytic notes that Brown and Clark talk about as part of that process. We're not doing any coding at this stage, but MAXQDA is gathering at this space in the code system here, paraphrase segments, all of the segments that we've paraphrased together for us, even though we're not thinking at that kind of categorization level that coding is. So that's a very useful mechanism. And here we are making those notes at the level of the data item. You may remember that they distinguish between making notes at the data item and then also at the level of the data set as a whole. So here as an example of data stored in the documents area, and we can link a memo to a whole data set, and there is actually a space within the memo where we can summarize the data set. So as well as making those little notes within the data at particular data items, we can also do that at the higher level. So we've got both of those abilities implemented, embedded in the way that the software works exactly for those tasks. Okay, where the power comes is the ability to visualize those notes and pull them together. So not just to make them, but to identify and gather them together. So here's an example of retrieving the segments that have been paraphrased. So the idea would be that you make multiple of these paraphrases in the data, and they are automatically, without you having to think about it or consider it, gathered together so that you can retrieve and see together at any time, as well as seeing them embedded in the data. And that's something that, of course, if you're working in Word, they're just only available to you at the data level, but MAXQDA pulls them together as well. And hopefully you can see that if you're working in hard copy, then this MAXQDA way of creating and then pulling together, visualizing these notes at the data item level is really, really powerful. Okay, so that's a few ways in which MAXQDA, the use of MAXQDA, can really facilitate that first phase of reflexive thematic analysis, as Brown and Clark describe it. Their second phase is what they call coding. Okay, and I'm sure many of us are very familiar with coding. Coding happens in many different analytic methods, and coding is enabled and implemented in MAXQDA in a whole range of very sophisticated ways. But what do they say about the process of coding? So again, I've highlighted in red the tasks that they're talking about, and in green the different levels at which they discuss this process of coding. So they talk about systematically working through the data set in a fine-grained way. So that's a low data level task, to identify segments that appear potentially interesting, relevant, or meaningful to your research question, and applying what we would call a code, an analytically meaningful description, and they call those code labels as well. So they make a distinction here about what the focus of that coding is, and they explicitly say that in their approach to thematic analysis, then it's possible and relevant to code at different levels, and they differentiate between two different levels where coding may happen. But what they're also talking about towards the end of this little summary is that coding isn't just about summarizing or reducing the content, the materials, but it's also about capturing your analytic take on the data, okay? So I want to pick out a few of these things as well. But the last thing that they say is something that's really important. We'll come back to it later. When done, so after the coding, you then collate everything together. And as we know, those of us who've used MAXQDA before, those of you who are new to it, it's really important to realize that that happens automatically. That's not a separate step in MAXQDA. So let's have a look a little bit more systematically about how MAXQDA can help this phase of coding. And again, just because of the amount of time that we've got today, I'm just going to pick out a few of these to illustrate to you in the following slides. You can look at these in a bit more detail in your own time, but I want to show you how the coding phase, when we're using MAXQDA, is not necessarily have to be a separate phase from the first phase of familiarization. They can build on one another, these two phases, and they can happen in tandem, actually. So it's really flexible, the software, to allow us to be thinking in different ways at the same time, or keep things separately if we want to. So that's what we're talking about here. We can code separately from paraphrasing or together. So I want to show you the categorized paraphrases tool. I want to talk a little bit about this idea about capturing analytic meaning and talk about how that can actually happen in MAXQDA beyond code labels. And I'll use memos as the way of illustrating that, but you can see that that can also happen in different ways as well. And I really want to pull out and make the key point, which is about the iteration and the continual retrieval, reviewing, and recoding that happens just naturally when you're using MAXQDA, but is necessarily separated out as a step when you don't have a tool that's designed for the purpose. Okay, so let's have a look at a couple of these things. So I showed you earlier the paraphrasing, so making the paraphrases in the data. And this is the categorized paraphrase tool in MAXQDA, whereby you open up all of those paraphrase segments that you've created previously, and you're able to see the segment over here on the right-hand side is the segment that was paraphrased. On the left-hand side here is the comments that was made, and then making use of both of those, we can then start to code. And at this stage, what I'm showing here, only a very few codes have started to be created, and you can see that you apply them to both the segment and the paraphrase, actually, and through this middle column here. And hopefully you can see that multiple codes can be applied to the same paraphrase segment. So you don't have to be discrete and separate in that way. So that is designed to take us from that initial analytic note-taking stage or phase to the categorization of that to generate codes. So then we may have generated some codes here back in the main MAXQDA interface I am now. But we can see some of those codes starting to be listed here as that process happens. And we're able to create memos and add those codes as well to add more context, more description, more definition about what we're thinking about that pithy code label, as Clark would call it. And also, I just wanted to make the point about reflexivity. So they call their method reflexive thematic analysis to highlight the importance in their mind of reflecting on our role as researchers and all of the other contexts that come to the analysis of qualitative materials when you're working in this way. And I often create a code called reflexivity check that I then apply to segments of the data where I've actually been thinking about my interpretation at that level. And that's something that then can become very powerful because later on you can retrieve on that basis. So using codes in MAXQDA, not just to represent the concepts, but also as kind of process and methodological tags in the material as well, something that's very, very powerful. Okay, I mentioned this idea that everything is automatically gathered together. So the step of collating the code labels and then compiling the data segments, that's the terminology that Brown and Clark use. This is not a separate step in MAXQDA. This just happens by virtue of the coding process. So here you can see that I've just opened up an overview of coded segments so far for this one particular code about planning ahead, and they're all accessible to me in this list view. This is just one of several displays that I can generate, but always interconnected with the source context. So here I've got one of them highlighted in the overview, but I'm always able to locate back in the source context. So everything is interconnected. So the gathering happens automatically and the interconnectivity happens automatically. Not something that we have to worry about. MAXQDA takes care of that for us. Okay, we can talk about coding for a lot longer, but I'm going to move on now to phase 3, which Brown and Clark describe or call generating the initial themes. Okay, so again, red are those tasks, the specific tasks within that phase, and green the level that they're discussing. So here the aim is to start identifying shared patterned meaning across the whole data set. Okay, so the task is thinking about shared patterned meanings, and the level is across the whole data set in the way that they describe it. And they talk about that task-wise as compiling clusters of codes, and again at the bottom here collating all of the coded data relevant to each candidate theme. So without reading this whole description for you right now, the idea is that we look for patterns across the data based on the coding that we've done before. We start to gather those together and think about how they may potentially be themes, and then we gather the data at those potential or candidate themes, as they call them, in order to start thinking about their relevance. So let's have a little bit of a think about how MAXQDA can help. And MAXQDA can help vastly with this phase of reflexive thematic analysis. Again, there are many different ways. So we can see at the top here this task of identifying shared patterned meaning. There's a multitude of tools in MAXQDA which would allow us to do that. So subcode statistics and the code matrix browser, that's what I'm going to show you today. but also other tools, the code relations browser, the crosstabs, the summary tables. They're all tools that would allow us to accomplish that task. In terms of compiling clusters of codes as well, at least 4 different tools within MAXQDA that we could use for that purpose. I'm going to show you a couple of them there, the ones that are highlighted in yellow on my screen. And then again, this idea of collating all of the coded data relevant to each candidate theme. Again, this happens incrementally. It happens automatically as we carry out the earlier tasks. So isn't something that we need to think about as a separate task within this phase when we're using MAXQDA. All right, let me just show you a couple of illustrations. So identifying shared pattern meanings across the data set. We could do that in a chart. So us and them is a particular code, a potential top level code, a candidate theme in the terminology. That has, at this stage of the process, had, how many are there? 5 codes that had already been created that I started thinking about being related to this candidate theme. And we can see here how they are occurring across the data. So which of those is occurring more or less across the whole data set. And that can also be visualized according to individual respondents. So here I'm looking at a code matrix browser, and here you can see that candidate theme at the top, us and them. So that wasn't a code that had been created earlier, that was generated by looking at the other codes and starting to think, okay, there's 4 or 5 that seem to be something to do with the distinction between us who don't have children and them, those who do, or vice versa. And here I'm breaking that down using a code matrix browser across each respondent. So remember, this was Facebook posts. So each of these columns are the Facebook posters, if you like, the people who are posting on Facebook. And here we can see the number of times each one of those Facebook users is saying something that's been coded to any of these sub-codes. So this is an illustration of 2 different ways of starting to explore and subsequently identify those shared patterns across the whole data set. So in the first one, the subcode statistics, that's irrespective of the Facebook users, and in the code matrix browser broken down by Facebook user. Okay, then we've got this idea about compiling clusters of codes, and again, this can happen in a multitude of different ways. Here I'm just showing how the standard code scheme structure in MAXQDA, whereby we can have a top level code. There's the us and them one. It's got nothing at it. It's a coat hanger. It's a potential theme at the moment with these codes, and I can move my codes around. I can make them in different colors, and I can also start to generate subcodes from larger potential candidate themes from the smart coding tool. So if I've got a fairly broad code, so this idea about planning ahead, I could retrieve all of those coded segments and then break that down into sub themes or sub dimensions of that theme if I wanted to. So I can work both top down and bottom up, and I can represent those also using sets. I haven't got an illustration of that as well, but in forming that clustering process, we can use maps and models. So here I've pulled in some potential themes into a map in order to start to think about which are occurring more or less frequently across my data set. Remember the level that they advocate thinking about in this phase is across the whole data set. So here I'm looking at the codes and how they're related to other codes in terms of the overlap in the data. The thicker the line is, the more co-occurrence is happening. Okay, so that's a few examples from that phase in terms of how MAXQDA can help. Then we've got phase 4, developing and reviewing themes. This is similar in many respects, but they've got multiple more tasks here. So they're talking about assessing the fit of the provisional candidate themes, checking that they make sense, revising the whole coding scheme, and that's quite a common thing to do, and considering the relationship between themes and existing knowledge. So those are 4 of the tasks. And again, they're differentiating between these different levels at which we work. And surprise, surprise, there are loads of tools in MAXQDA that we could use to help us with the tasks within this phase. And again, I'm just going to pick out a few. Some I've already shown you in earlier phases, but now I just want to talk very briefly about creative coding, crosstabs and models as examples of tools that can be used to accomplish these tasks. So just to be clear, when you're looking at the slides later in more detail, in bold at the top are the tasks according to Brown and Clark, and underneath in unbold are the tools in MAXQDA that we could use to help us with those tasks. Let's just have a look at a couple of these things on the slides. Creative coding, I think there was a spotlight about this as well. This is a means by which that radical revision of the coding scheme can happen. So you can put all the codes here. You can see at this stage all these codes that were not yet organized. They can be put into the creative coding space, and then you can draw lines to indicate how you want to reorganize the coding scheme. And then when you finish organizing the codes, you can implement that back into the coding system, and that's how you can generate that hierarchical list of codes, so those candidate themes and the subcodes. And also something that I find incredibly useful is not just thinking at the level of the codes, but also being able to retrieve the actual coded segments within a map and being able to kind of stack them and move them around and start thinking about subcoding. So I made that differentiation between working bottom up, which the creative coding is an example of, and then breaking things down as well. So if I realize that actually there's different aspects or dimensions to this idea of planning ahead, then thinking about how they may be present in the data is really useful to look at the actual segments and move them around the space in MaxMaps before I start recoding. And then also I've mentioned models before. Here's another example. This is looking at all of the codes so far in the project and looking at a high level about which ones are more connected based on frequency of overlap. So when people are talking about more than one thing together in the data. So this is very difficult to see in detail at the moment. But the darker lines, as I mentioned earlier, are to do with the more frequent overlap. So that's an aspect of those patterns that we were talking about earlier. That can also happen by using crosstabs. So here what I've got is a crosstab picking out a few of the codes that I'm interested in and looking at those in relation to whether the Facebook users had children themselves or not. So through reading their posts, you could determine whether they had children or not by what they were saying, and where it was determined that they didn't have children, that was indicated using a variable. Where it was determined that they did have children, that was indicated by using a variable. Where it wasn't clear whether they did or not from their responses, then that was also a variable value of unclear. So one of the things in terms of looking at patterns is thinking about, okay, maybe parents have different opinions about this topic from people who are not parents. So that gives us an idea frequency-wise, but from a qualitative level, I can then use the interactive quote matrix. I can access the interactive quote matrix from here in order to make a comparison on the level of what they're actually saying. So here basically is the column for the no's for one particular code. So I've got both of those levels that allows me to start thinking. Okay, I'm realizing that I'm way over time as per usual. So very quickly, refining, defining, naming themes is the next phase according to Brown and Clark, and that of course can happen along the way. They talk about writing a brief synopsis and really thinking about the label of each theme. And again, we can do that in using various different tools in MAXQDA. I'm going to very briefly just remind you of the summaries tool. Those of you who came to my summaries session yesterday will know a little bit about summaries, but this in some ways looks similar to the interactive quote matrix that I showed you earlier, but this time we're looking at the summaries that you as the researcher have made around, about the coded data rather than looking at the coded data themselves. And that's a real powerful way that you can write synopses in MAXQDA. We can also do that by creating memos, as I showed earlier. Okay, so finally they talk about writing up, where you finesse and finish the writing process, bringing together the analytic narrative and using compelling, vivid data extracts is the way that they describe that. And again, as we've seen, there are writing spaces integrated throughout MAXQDA, paraphrases, comments, memos, the project log summaries. Some of those I've shown today, others you will have seen in other sessions. But we've also got this ability to generate dynamic and grounded and visual representations of qualitative data and themes in a variety of different ways. So the quote matrices are particularly useful, but some of these other things I've talked about before. And also, if you haven't used the QTT tool before, then I really recommend you have a look at that, because it provides a space where you can be gathering the evidence for answering your research questions, etc., as you go through the analysis process. So it doesn't need to be a separate stage of your work. Okay, so this is just an example of that map I showed you earlier in the QTT tool, and that can be exported out. But what I wanted to finish up with, to look at the questions, is just to go back and think about those 6 phases. So for me, the use of MAXQDA for thematic analysis, whether it's Brown and Clark's reflexive thematic analysis or another form of thematic analysis, is all about being able to maximize flexibility, iteration, and transparency. Transparency I haven't really talked about today, but we can illustrate how we've gone about our analysis much more powerfully through our use of MAXQDA than we ever can if we're not using dedicated tools. And the reason for the maximization of those 3 things, flexibility, iteration, and transparency, is because everything is connected. Okay, so hopefully I've illustrated that a little bit. I'm sure you've seen that throughout the conference, but the thing that I really want to make the point about is that it's a lot more iterative. It's a lot more flexible when we're using MAXQDA than it appears by thinking about these 6 phases, because I can move these puzzle pieces around. I can flick backwards and forwards between different tasks, different levels, different stages of thinking at any time without ever losing connection with anything. And that for me is the real reason why I would use MAXQDA for thematic analysis to power up my process and my rigor. Okay, I put my headphones back in, but now I can hear myself. Let's have a look at the questions. I'm going to go to the Q&A first. Can you show again how you produce the cluster of codes where you connect the labels in step 3? Okay, let me just go back. So clustering codes can happen in lots of different ways. So let's just go back to the higher level. So what I showed you, Danielle, was the code hierarchies and the smart coding, but you can also do clusters of codes using code sets, and I actually quite like that. But just to go back to what I actually showed, if you think about clusters of codes, in the process that I talked about, you would probably have a lot of unorganized codes all at the same level initially, and then you could cluster them just by moving them and hanging them underneath top level codes which operate as those candidate themes at this stage, but don't actually have any data coded at them, but are just operating as means of gathering things together. So when I looked through the codes I had, I thought, okay, there's some things which are to do with this contrast between us and them. There's quite a lot of distinction there. And these were the 5 codes that I thought had to do with that. So that was what I was thinking about there. And that was the bottom-up way, yes? Whereas what I was showing in the coding tool was the idea of breaking down a broader code. So here I'm looking at all of the segments that are coded at one code, planning ahead, retrieving them in here, and realizing actually there's different things about planning ahead that I may want to capture. So then generating subcodes from that one. So you end up with something similar, but from a top-down way rather than the bottom-up way. And MAXQDA gives you the flexibility of doing both of those things for different areas of the codes, if that makes sense. Hopefully that answers your question. Anya, many people say they have done a grounded theory study when in fact they have done a thematic analysis. And people who use software are more likely, oh, where did that go? Are more likely to say they use grounded theory compared to those who don't, according to my research. What would you say are the two main differences between the two approaches? Between grounded theory and thematic analysis, I think, so reflexive thematic analysis, I think, has many similarities with grounded theory, but is not necessarily about generating a theory. So thematic analysis is more about looking at patterned meaning across the data. You could argue that that's a dimension of what a theory is. But in my experience, a thematic analysis doesn't necessarily have to have one core concept around which the different elements are coming from, which is what grounded theory is often about. So I think there's lots of similarities, but that would be the core difference, I would think, if between reflexive thematic analysis. Reflexive thematic analysis is quite bottom up often, but I think this is one of the difficulties with our whole field of qualitative data analysis, is that different terms are used to refer to very similar things sometimes, and similar terms are used to refer to very different things as well. You may be getting to this, but is it possible to pull summaries across codes in one place? Yeah, I'd recommend, sorry, I'm not sure who asked that question, but I recommend that you look at the summaries. Actually, the MAXDAYS team has answered that. Yeah, look at the summary table, that's absolutely right. And the spotlight on summaries looked at that in more detail. Where is the QT team located? Okay, that's already been answered as well. Thank you for that. What about framework analysis? So framework analysis is often seen as a type of thematic analysis. And the idea of framework analysis was developed in the 1980s by NatCen, the National Centre for Social Research in the UK in London. And that's all about thematic analysis that abstracts to the summary level. And then the analysis happens of the summaries. So very quickly they reduce the data from the original actual material to the research summaries, and then they look and compare and analyze the summaries. And MAXQDA's summary tool is really well suited for operationalizing framework analysis. But framework analysis has lots of commonalities to other forms of thematic analysis. But the idea is that you're fairly quickly summarizing the data in order to reduce it. So abstracting away from the original source material quite quickly through that summarization process. There's a few excellent articles and books around framework analysis. If you get in touch with me, I will share those with you, no problem. Okay, I think that's everything in the Q&A, so I'll just have a quick look at the chat. In fact, I've gone over time already, so probably ought to finish. On the slide, crosstabs focus groups were some of the items on that chart created from variables and the other items from codes. Absolutely. Where was that slide? I can't remember where that slide was. Here. Yes. So down the left-hand side here, these are all codes. So you can see these are this is at a later stage of the project from what the codes I showed earlier, where we're starting to think about different themes. And these column headers here, they are variables. They're applied, it's a crosstab for focus groups because this data was just only one document. It was Facebook posts. So it came into MAXQDA as one document only, with each Facebook user's response indicated by an anonymized indicator. So it was effectively like a focus group in the sense it had multiple people's responses, short responses within it. And that's why I couldn't use document variables because I only had one document. So I treated it like a focus group. And then these variable values, yes, no, and unclear, were associated with the focus group speakers, even though it's not focus group data, they're still speakers. But they were identified through reading the posts because it was Facebook data. I didn't know who actually had children or not, but I intuited that by reading through. So, for example, some people explicitly said, I do or I don't have children. So that's where that came. Okay, so I think we've come to the end of my time.